a lonely cowboy, woke up to find 3 native sisters on his porch. They told him he had until sundown. Before we ride into this story, take a moment to drop a comment below. Tell us where you're listening from, what town or stretch of land you're calling home tonight. And when we reach the end, don't forget to rate this tale from 0 to 10. Now lean back, settle in, and let the dust carry you. She watched 25 men try and fail, and still left the gate open for just one more. For 3 long years, no one had come close to riding that black stallion. Not ranch hands, not wranglers, not even the best from 2 counties over. And the woman who loved that horse, she'd stopped waiting, stopped believing, until one morning, just past sunup, a stranger came down the ridge, didn't speak, didn't swagger, just stood quiet beside the fence, like he knew what it meant to be broken, and what it took to stay still. The stallion didn't rear, didn't bolt. When the dust settled, he bowed. Some folks say it was skill, others call it fate. But Catherine Sterling, she knows different. He didn't ride like a cowboy. He rode like he'd been born in the fall of thunder, like the horse had waited his whole life just for him. The widow and the horse. Catherine Sterling didn't smile much anymore, not since the day they brought Elias home in the back of a wagon, his body stiff with blood and dust, his boots still warm. Folks said he died doing what he loved, trying to break a stallion no one else could ride. But Catherine knew better. Love wasn't supposed to break you. It was supposed to stay. So, when the neighbors came with pie and prayers, when the casseroles filled her kitchen, and the condolences her ears, Catherine kept one thing and sent the rest away. Tempest, the black stallion, the one that threw Elias, fire in his blood, grief in his eyes. No one touched him after that. Some said he was cursed. Others whispered he mourned like a widow in his own way. But Catherine, she understood. Every Sunday, she opened the ranch gates. 25 men came, one by one, all spurs and swagger, thick with bourbon and bravado. And every single one of them got thrown hard. Catherine never flinched, just stood on her porch, arms crossed, coffee in hand. Then she'd nod once and say the same thing. Next, word spread like wildfire across the county. The Sterling widow was offering $200 to any man who could ride her husband's horse for 10 minutes. To some, it sounded like pride. To others, madness. But to Catherine, it was something else. A test? Maybe. A ritual? Or just a stubborn kind of hope she hadn't yet buried. Then one morning, as the summer heat faded into a breeze that felt like endings, a stranger came walking slow down the ridge, didn't ride in like the others, didn't shout his name or flash a grin, just led a copper-colored horse behind him, tipped his hat once, and waited, didn't say much, didn't smile either. Catherine met him at the gate. Name. He glanced down, then looked her straight in the eye. Jake, Morrison, you know what this is about. He nodded, not with arrogance, but with something quieter, something older. Ain't here for the money, he said. Then he looked past her, to the corral, where Tempest paced like memory on hooves, just here to see if he's ready. Catherine didn't answer. She just watched how the stallion slowed when Jake stepped closer, watched how the wind tugged at the man's coat and he didn't flinch, watched the way his shoulders sat, not proud, not broken, just tired in the way that only war can make a man tired. She'd seen men try to tame that horse with rope and rage, with curses and cracked knuckles. But this one, he hadn't lifted a hand, hadn't raised a voice. He just stood there, still as a fence post, like he knew what pain was and wasn't trying to outrun it. And for the first time in 3 years, Catherine didn't feel like saying, "Next." She just turned toward the house and said, soft and simple, "We'll see." Part 1. The widow's challenge. By the time the 25th man hit the dirt, no one gasped anymore. The crowd had thinned, the coffee had cooled, and Catherine Sterling just poured the last of hers into the dust, steady as ever. She didn't speak. She never did. Not until they were flat on their backs, or crawling off with pride cracked like old bone. Even then, just one word, next. But that morning, there was no next, just the hush of wind slipping through the cottonwoods, and a black stallion pacing the far fence line, muscles rippling like thunderclouds that hadn't made up their mind. They called him Tempest. 3 years untouched since the day he threw Elias Sterling, Catherine's husband, and left him broken in the dust, boots still warm. No one had stayed on his back longer than 4 seconds since, and yet, every Sunday, the gate swung open, and every Sunday, another fool with a rope and a reason stepped up to be thrown. They came with spurs, with swagger, with stories already half-written. They left with bruises and new stories they never meant to tell. But anyone who really looked at Catherine could tell she wasn't searching for a rider. She was waiting for something else, something unnamed, or maybe something buried so deep even she couldn't touch it. Still, she kept the gate open. Across the yard, a stranger leaned against the barn wall, hadn't spoken since sunrise, didn't bring a saddle, didn't ask questions. He led a copper-colored horse behind him, tied loose under the shade, and carried with him a kind of quiet that didn't need explaining. He watched the latest man fall, didn't laugh, didn't flinch, just watched. Catherine noticed. She set her tin mug down on the porch rail and called out without turning. "You." He lifted his eyes. Calm, direct. "You come to ride." He took a beat. "Depends," he said. "On what?" He spat the straw from his mouth, slow as river silt, and his breath smelled of cold mornings and burnt coffee. "On whether he wants me to." Catherine stepped off the porch. Her boots crunched gravel like breaking bones. "Hey, it's $200 if you last 10 minutes. He shook his head. "Don't want your money." She narrowed her gaze, like a knife being tested on tough rope. "Then why are you here?" His eyes drifted not to her, not to the others, but to the stallion pacing alone in the dust. "Because I know what it's like," he said, "to be looked at, but not touched, to carry something no one sees, to be asked for more than you've got left." Catherine didn't answer, didn't have to. She understood. He stepped toward the gate, not proud, not nervous, just present, steady, intentional, like a man walking toward something he'd already made peace with. "But I won't cross," he said, "unless you open it." She studied him. Worn boots, a faint scar above his left brow, hands that didn't fidget, didn't clench, just still. Then, without a word, she turned and unlatched the gate. He didn't climb the rails, didn't reach for a rope. He stepped inside, sat down in the dirt, cross-legged, palms resting gently on his knees, like a boy in church, waiting for the sermon to begin. A few onlookers chuckled, but not Catherine, and not Tempest. A minute passed, then 2, then 3. The stallion didn't bolt, didn't rear. He just watched. Then, slowly, deliberately, he took a step, then another, until he stood just 10 feet from the man in the dirt. And Jake, he didn't move, didn't speak, just breathed. Tempest lowered his head, not in submission, but in something quieter, something harder to name. A bow from one wounded soul to another. Catherine felt something shift, not in the wind, not in the corral, but deep in her chest, like an old latch coming loose. Without a sound, she didn't say next, didn't say anything at all. But as she turned back toward the house, her lips parted just enough for a word that had been waiting 3 years to find breath. Maybe. Part 2. The cowboy who didn't want the money. He didn't come back the next day, didn't show the next week either. And Catherine, though she'd never say it out loud, found herself looking every time a wagon creaked past the ridge, every time the wind shifted just right. Her eyes drifted, but nothing came. Then one morning, just as the frost began to melt from the windows, she stepped onto the porch with her coffee in hand, and there he was, sitting on the corral fence like he'd always been there. Same coat, same quiet, same copper horse tied loose beneath the mesquite. "You took your time," she said. "I wasn't in a hurry," he answered. She didn't ask why. Didn't need to, because Tempest was already at the gate. Ears forward, tail swaying like a slow metronome, Jake stepped down and gave the stallion a nod. Not a cue, not a challenge, just recognition. And Catherine felt it again, that odd, uninvited pull beneath the ribs, like a memory surfacing too soon. He moved into the corral the way some men enter a chapel, without spectacle, without fear. Tempest didn't flinch, didn't shy, didn't even blink. Jake didn't try to mount, didn't test. He just walked beside him, step for step, one circle, then another, their rhythm syncing like two songs, slowly finding the same key. By the third loop, Tempest dropped his head. Jake brushed his hand across the stallion's shoulder, gentle, brief, and turned to leave. Catherine met him halfway across the yard. "You always walk away before the hard part?" she asked. He shrugged. "I ain't here to break him." "Then what are you here for?" He looked at her, really looked. "I reckon some things don't need breaking," he said. "Just remembering how to stand still beside someone." She didn't answer, not out loud. But that evening, she set a second plate on the porch table, just in case. He didn't come every day, but when he did, he never knocked. Sometimes he mended fences, oiled squeaky hinges, cleared brush that had been left too long. Didn't ask, didn't wait for thanks. Other times, he simply sat by the corral, humming old tunes that sounded less like songs and more like prayers men whisper when they've long stopped believing, but haven't stopped hoping someone might still hear. Catherine would sit nearby, knitting without purpose, ears straining without lifting her eyes. One afternoon, she finally asked, "You always this quiet?" Jake looked up from where he sat, back leaned against the water trough. "I used to talk more. What happened?" "I stopped needing to." She thought on that longer than she meant to. That night, she didn't sleep, not from dreams, but from the strange comfort of knowing someone was out there, not close, just near enough. On the fifth visit, she found him brushing Tempest's mane. The stallion didn't resist, didn't shift, just stood there, quiet as sunrise under Jake's hand. When he heard her step, Jake looked up. "You want him saddled today?" he asked. She didn't answer right away, just stared. At the horse they once called cursed. At the man no one expected to stay. "You're not like the others," she said. Jake didn't look up. "I ain't trying to prove anything. Most men are." He nodded. "Most men ain't been undone yet." She blinked at that. Undone. It wasn't a word folks used much in this town, but there it was, laid between them like an opened book, a story neither of them had written, but both had lived. Later that day, she handed him an envelope. $200. Jake looked at it, then at her. "I told you, I didn't come for the money." She held his gaze. "It's not for the horse." "Then what's it for?" "For showing up," she said, when I didn't ask. Jake didn't take the envelope, didn't step away either. He just said, quiet as dusk, "You needed someone to see. You still had a gate worth opening." And this time, she didn't pretend not to understand. She set the envelope on the porch rail, turned back toward the door, but left it open behind her. Final image, Jake walking slow toward the corral. Tempest follows behind him, no rope, no lead, just choice. And from the shadows of the doorway, Catherine watches the way silence moves with him. Not heavy, not hollow, just honest. Part 3, the ride that changed everything. It was just after dawn, when the sky turned the color of old gold spilling over the hills, and frost clung to the fence rails like breath that hadn't quite exhaled. Catherine hadn't meant to be watching the barn, but there she stood, coffee cooling in her hand, eyes locked on the slow shadow moving across the yard. Jake had saddled Tempest in silence. No audience, no command, just the whisper of wind, a crow calling from far off, and the creak of leather worn soft by time, the sound of memory being stirred. She stepped off the porch before she knew she'd moved. "You sure?" she asked. He nodded once, steady, quiet, and with the calm of a man who'd waited his whole life for this moment, but never chased it. Jake swung into the saddle. Tempest didn't rear, didn't test, didn't tense. He stood still, ears forward, body poised like prayer. Catherine forgot to breathe. Not until the horse began to move. They didn't gallop. They didn't test the wind or push for distance. They just rode up the ridge, down along the dry creek bed, through the cottonwoods, where Elias had once carved their initials into bark now smoothed by seasons. Jake didn't speak, and neither did she. He rode like the ache in his chest had found rhythm beneath him, like the horse beneath him didn't carry weight, but understanding. By the time they reached the northern fence line, Catherine stopped pretending, not pretending to care, but pretending it wasn't there. That thing she felt, not longing, not attraction, recognition, the kind that passes between war-weathered strangers on a train platform, the kind that doesn't require words, just knowing. Two broken things, seeing each other, not as wreckage, but as proof that survival doesn't mean you walk away clean. At the far ridge, they stopped. The land stretched out, wide and quiet. A hawk wheeled above, and somewhere in the distance, a cook fire's smoke curled into sky. Jake dismounted, led Tempest to the narrow creek, and knelt to drink beside him. Then he sat with his back against a tree. Hat tipped low, Catherine joined him. They didn't touch, but their shoulders sat close, just enough for warmth to pass between. And that's when he said it, soft, without looking. My wife used to hum when she cooked. Even when we had nothing, she'd hum, like her voice could trick the beans into thinking they were a feast. Catherine turned, but he didn't. She got sick. Quick. Army kept me back 1 week too long. By the time I came home, the house was empty, and her song was gone. Silence. Then buried her with the apron. Still had flour on it. He didn't cry. He just breathed. And in that space, Catherine let her own silence unravel. My husband died under that horse. Jake looked up slow. Careful. I was the one who opened the gate. Told him he could do it. Said Tempest would never hurt him. She laughed once. A brittle, bitter sound. They blamed the horse. I blamed me. The wind passed through the cottonwoods, not rustling, just whispering. Then Jake spoke. Sometimes guilt's just love with nowhere left to go. She closed her eyes, and something inside her, something tight and buried deep, finally let go. On the ride back, Tempest picked up pace, not wild, not forced, just sure. Like he'd found his footing. Jake let him run, and for the first time in 3 years, Catherine smiled, not because of memory, not for anyone watching, just because something in her chest had finally become light enough to rise. Back at the barn, Jake slid from the saddle. She handed him a tin cup of water. Their fingers touched barely, but it felt like thunder. Final image, Jake brushing down Tempest, the stallion still as ever, calm. Catherine stands in the barn doorway, her hand resting on a beam where Elias once carved her name. She presses her palm flat against it, doesn't look back, but she says barely louder than breath, "Come back tomorrow." And Jake, without turning, says simply, "I will." Part 4. North Pasture. It was the North Pasture that did it. Catherine hadn't ridden out that far since the funeral. The grass still grew wild up there, taller than a man's knee. Fences leaned like tired shoulders. And the old sugar maple, the one Elias used to tie Tempest beneath, stood split clean down the middle by lightning 2 summers back. Jake rode ahead, Tempest's hooves slicing smooth lines through the field, as if the land itself remembered him. She followed behind on Junebug, a quiet little mare with soft eyes, not fast, not proud, but steady as the sunrise. They told themselves they were just checking fence, but they both knew. It wasn't about wire. It was about memory, about facing something that didn't have a face, but still lived in the dirt, in the bend of the trees, in the pause between birdsong and breeze. At the far edge of the pasture, Jake dismounted first, walked the fence line slow, ran a hand across a sun-warped post, blackened with age. "Place is tired," he said. "So am I," Catherine replied before she could stop herself. He looked back, eyes soft. She looked away. That's when they heard it. Wagon wheels, grinding gravel. 2 men from town. One she recognized. Sheriff Elbridge, big man, red-faced, badge worn too tight, like it held him together. The other she hadn't seen in 3 years. Benjamin Crane, Elias's cousin, didn't come to the funeral, didn't send word. Now here he was, stepping off a buckboard like he'd never left, like the dust owed him something. "Well," he said, brushing off his coat, "guess the rumors were true." Catherine didn't answer. He looked Jake over once, twice then, gave a single laugh. "This the new stable boy. Heard you were letting men crawl all over Elias's memory." Jake didn't blink, didn't move, just kept his hand resting on Tempest's reins. Benjamin sneered. "You forget whose name's still on half this land." "You sold your share," she said. "I leased it," he snapped. "To Elias, not to whoever this is." Jake stayed quiet, but Catherine stepped forward. "This land remembers who bled for it," she said. "You didn't." Benjamin's boots scuffed closer. "You forget who helped Elias buy this ranch. You think riding a horse and wearing black dresses makes you fit to run it." Her voice didn't rise, didn't shake. "I buried my husband with my own 2 hands while you were passed out drunk in Cheyenne." Silence fell. Even the birds stopped. Benjamin glared, then turned to Jake. "Careful, Cowboy. You might think you've tamed that horse, but that widow's just looking for someone else to blame." Jake didn't say a word. He didn't have to, because Tempest, slow and deliberate, stepped forward until he stood between Jake and the men, head high, eyes steady. Benjamin backed up without meaning to, and then Jake spoke, quiet as settling ash. "This land don't need louder men, just better ones." They left without another word. Dust rolled behind them like a scar reopened. Catherine stood still, fists curled. Jake didn't touch her, but he was close, close enough to feel like the ground held steady beneath her again. Later, they sat beneath the old sugar maple. The wind picked up. Clouds stretched thin and silver across the afternoon sky. Jake was the first to speak. "You ever think about leaving?" She nodded. "Almost did. Packed a bag. Got as far as the bridge. Junebug wouldn't cross." He smiled. "Smart horse." She smiled back just barely. "You," Jake hesitated. "Didn't think I'd stay this long. Why are you?" He looked at her then, and this time, for the first time, he didn't dodge the truth. "Because peace don't follow you. You have to find the place where it's willing to meet you." She looked at him, really looked, and whispered, just loud enough for the breeze to carry it. "I think it's here." Final image, the north pasture at dusk. The sugar maple split, but still standing. Jake walking the fence line, hammer slung over his shoulder. Catherine watching him from the porch, lantern glowing behind her. She places her hand on the door frame, over the mark where Elias once carved her name, and says, only to herself, "I don't need to ride alone anymore." Part 5. He rode like he was born to. The crowd gathered before noon. Word had spread through town like prairie fire. She's doing it again, letting someone ride the black. 25 had tried. 25 had fallen. But this time felt different. Not because anyone believed he'd succeed, but because she wasn't stopping it. The rails of the corral groaned beneath the weight of boots and suspicion. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders. Mothers stood silent, some remembering Elias, some just drawn to the kind of hush that comes before a storm or a miracle. And Catherine, she stood at the gate, hair tied back, gloves in hand, heart steady, but not still. Jake hadn't asked to do it, and she hadn't asked him to try. But something passed between them 2 nights ago when they sat on the porch, sharing silence the way old friends share bread. And now, here they were. Jake stepped into the corral like a man walking into a church with no preacher. Tempest stood in the center, untied, unbroken, waiting. No saddle, just reins looped and still, same as always. But something in the air said this time wasn't the same. Catherine watched his every move, not out of fear, but memory. This horse had taken her husband, but this man, he hadn't come to conquer. He came to listen. Jake laid a hand on Tempest's neck. The stallion didn't flinch. Jake whispered something. No one could hear it. Then, slowly, quietly, he swung onto the horse's bare back. Gasps rose from the crowd, but Tempest didn't buck, didn't tense. He moved, a walk, then a trot, and then without whip, without force, he ran. Jake rode like he'd been born to. Not to prove, not to win, but to carry something that didn't belong to him, and carry it gently. Dust rose around them like mist at morning. His body moved with the horse, not mastering, not yielding, just becoming. And for a moment, the crowd stopped breathing, because this wasn't just a man on a horse. It was something older, something the land hadn't seen in years. Grace. Catherine's hand gripped the gatepost, her knuckles white, her throat tight. She didn't cry, not then, but when Jake slowed Tempest to a walk and dismounted, without drama, without flourish, just a quiet pat on the stallion's shoulder, she felt it. That small, invisible shift, the one where grief loosens its grip, and forgiveness doesn't come in words, but in watching someone choose gentleness where others had chosen fear. The sheriff was there. Benjamin, too. Neither said a word. They couldn't, because the town had witnessed something no badge, no claim, no blood right could touch. A man ride not to win, but to understand. Jake walked toward her, reins in hand, dust on his coat, hair tousled by the wind. Catherine met him at the rail. He let you, she said. Jake nodded. Only because I didn't ask him to. She reached for the reins, but Jake held them just a second longer, then placed them in her hands, not as a prize, but as a gesture. This is still yours. And in return, Catherine did something no one expected. She lifted his hand, kissed the scar across his knuckles, and whispered, "You brought him home." That night, the ranch was quiet again, the crowd gone, the rails empty. But from the kitchen window, a soft light glowed. Inside, 2 silhouettes moved slow, like a dance long forgotten, learning each other's rhythm. Not rushing, just present. A kettle steamed, boots lay by the door, and out in the pasture, Tempest stood beneath the stars, head low, eyes closed, finally, at peace. A wooden plaque, carved by hand, hung beside the gate. He rode like he was born to, for Elias, for the quiet ones, for those who choose to stay. The wind never really settled in that part of Wyoming. It still moves through the tall grass of the North Pasture, like a ghost brushing its fingers across the past. And maybe that's why Tempest, the black stallion, stayed there until the end of his days. Never ran, never needed tying. They say Catherine never remarried. But she wasn't alone, either Jake stayed, not for the land, not for the horse, not for any promise spoken out loud. He stayed because sometimes, after war, after silence, after loss, the only thing worth holding on to is the one person who doesn't ask you to become someone new, just someone real. Years later, kids still climb the rail of that same old corral and ask about the carving on the gate, and the ranch hands, they just smile and say, that was the day the horse chose the rider, not the other way around. So tell us, what did this story stir in you? Drop your thoughts in the comments and rate it from 0 to 10 below. And if you want more stories like this, tales of quiet strength, open gates, and second chances, subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss the next ride. Because sometimes a story doesn't need gunshots or glory. Sometimes all it needs is a broken man, a stubborn horse, and a woman brave enough to leave the gate open one more time. If this story touched something in you, just know the next one goes even deeper. And if you've ever chosen silence over revenge, comment below. I understand Jake. We'll see you on the next trail. He rode like he was born to.